project that is called Remnants of the Future, and which started in Armenia on the invitation of an arts organization there. And when I was in Armenia, I came across a ghost town in the north of Armenia called Mush 2. We can see a building here. It's an incredible place. It's an entire town that was built after the Spitak earthquake in 1988. Had a very devastating effect on the second Armenian city, Gyumri, in the north. And at that moment, Armenia was still part of the Soviet Union. So it was Gorbachev at the time said, we're going to build a new city to rehouse the people who became homeless in the earthquake. And they started in 1989 to build this new city. It ended up as the last big social housing project of the Soviet Union. They're using the kind of, there is a number of building styles that are being employed. And the local population named the city Mush 2, which is interesting in its own right, because Mush 1, I mean, it's now called Mush 1, but the original Mush is a city in Turkey, which was populated by Armenians until the genocide in 1915. And the Armenians that managed to flee in 1915 and crossed the mountains into Armenia proper, they settled in this region. So a lot of the people who lived there had ancestors who actually came from Mush. So it was interesting to me as this kind of loaded place where several histories come together, the history or the commemoration of the genocide, but also the trauma of the earthquake itself. And then, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91. The Soviet Union breaks down. Armenia becomes independent and has no means to continue this project. So all the workers are recalled to Moscow, and the entire place is left abandoned. So I spent a lot of time there, and initially it looked like a film set. And as I spent more time there, I found out that people are living there off-grid, that they are sort of creating sort of units of habitation within these buildings, and yeah, very much live there without water and electricity connection. And more importantly, I also found that there was a kind of symbiotic and destructive relationship to the place. So people were doing work there on their own apartments, fixing things within these buildings, but they also started to cut out a lot of the metal from the building itself, to sell as scrap metal. So that was a big thing. So there was this kind of, as I said, symbiotic and destructive relationship, because obviously the more you take out, the more fragile the structures become eventually. The film was sort of structured in a 24-hour cycle. So it starts at night and it ends at night. When some of the people are leaving, but some people are also living there full time. And then at night, it sort of becomes a sci-fi film, and there is an arrival of a character from a Mayakovsky novel, The Bathhouse. So the phosphorescent woman from this play, not novel, play, arrives there from the future, and which is a future post-Soviet Union, written in the 1930s. And she basically picks up the people from Mush too, and takes them to this sort of new future. And yeah, so I was making this film, but then I felt, oh, this is now shown on the other side of this same wall. It's a CinemaScope projection. And so I went to Mush, and of course found a city that was full of signs of Armenian life that had been sketched out. So here you can see there is Armenian writing. You can still see a little bit. A few letters are almost visible, but it had been completely scratched out. And this is just within the structure of buildings, the fabric of the building itself. There are churches, there's stones with inscriptions. And when you ask people who lived in this building before, everybody says, I don't know. There's a kind of, yeah, a sort of shame around it. And the history is not spoken about. And then I also traveled outside in Eastern Anatolia. I was interested in seeing other traces, and most of the traces of Armenian life had been destroyed. There's very, very few churches left. For example, this one here in the middle of a landscape. But most traces had been destroyed. In fact, there was a campaign of destruction in the 1960s where the military actively started to bomb sites that had survived the genocide, Armenian sites that were perhaps ruins or abandoned buildings, like this building, which was the Armenian monastery Surb Karapet. It was the biggest Armenian monastery, and apparently the bones of John the Baptist had been kept there, Armenia being one of the first nations who had adopted Christianity. So Surb Karapet, the monastery, survived the genocide and was there as a ruin, as an empty building, and it was bombed in the 60s. And subsequently, a Kurdish population was invited to establish a village on that site. So they built a village, and they also used the stones from the monastery that were still lying around. So you can see them here in the building itself, just at the top of the ladder, behind the ladder, or here with a stone with crosses inscribed. So the huts and buildings of this village have the history of the former monastery inscribed. Or here a chicken, a place where chicken are kept that was obviously part of the monastery architecture that was still standing. But the story and history, of course, isn't ending there, because as we know, the Kurdish population themselves were persecuted, especially during the kind of PKK wars in the 90s. Also, the Kurdish population are not allowed to use their own language in schools. for example, as an official language. So the village itself was also attacked. So the film that I eventually made tries to trace this cycle of violence, which goes back even further. It sort of slowly goes back. And I worked with a dengbej, a sort of troubadour, a Kurdish troubadour, where they sing history. So historical events are often captured in songs because they can't be written in history books or taught in schools. So they're captured in songs. Which is the case here. Yeah, and then the history goes even further back, because on this very site there was also a Demeter temple previously in Roman times. The Armenians were killed in the genocide or fled to Armenia, today's Armenia, or Lebanon, Syria, where there are significant Armenian populations. There were practically no Armenians left in these places. And in this case, the monastery Surp Karapet was only destroyed in the 1960s. So it was there as a ruin. Then it was bombed. It was empty, but it was bombed to destroy the traces of the violent past, because Turkey says we never committed the genocide. And so the traces were actively trying to be erased. And then a Kurdish population, and the Kurds, of course, as a minority that has very little rights, also often gets instrumentalized. And I don't know what they knew or didn't know, but yeah, the stones of the monastery became part of the village. And in Mush itself, of course, people live in the buildings that were Armenian buildings, and now they're inhabited by, again, a Kurdish population that knows what happened, but is unable to speak about it because, of course, being oppressed, an oppressed minority themselves, they also live in fear. And it's a very complex situation, inhabiting buildings of another oppressed community that was killed and chased away. And so it's not like the Kurdish populations are the victors in this situation. And I guess it's these complexities that I'm interested in, and it's difficult to convey this just by talking about the work. That's why I need to make the work. And it needs time to kind of enter that place and begin to understand some of these complexities by, engaging with it. I did make a conscious choice at some point to move away from histories where I have a kind of identity connection to it through my family history, and where I felt I was in a privileged position in relation to the subject matter, and therefore I have a right to speak about it, to histories that I feel concern us, at least us Europeans, but us maybe wider us, and where there are lingering entanglements and implications that I feel I need to look at, and not just at, for example, the traces of the Holocaust because my family was implicated in that history. I felt that questions of how do we face these kinds of sites, the questions of kind of historical responsibility, of witnessing, of the ghosts essentially in the present. And ghosts, I mean, I wanted to speak about this later, but by ghosts I mean unfinished business from the past, demands for justice, as kind of Avery Gordon talks about it in Ghostly Matters. So I feel that it was not enough for me to just talk about these ghosts that I inherited in my family history. Of course, it makes it extremely sensitive because I don't have any authority. I don't have an immediate right to speak about this. The question is there, who are you to talk about this, to make work about this? And I try to face this question. It's part of what I do. I suppose precisely because of this, it started actually with a work about the Benin bronzes. I was invited to make work sort of tentatively around restitution in 2007, and I was expected to make work about looted Holocaust art. But I lived in London at the time, and the British Museum has a huge collection of the so-called Benin bronzes that were looted in 1897 and came to Europe and are now in museums all over the world, in all major cities. And to me, it felt it's the biggest loot of modern times, where the entire cache of a culture was stolen. I live in London. I have free access to the British Museum that calls itself a universal museum. What do I do with this? I become implicated in this history, even if it's not I don't have British ancestors who did this, and I don't have, obviously, Edo ancestors in Nigeria who were affected by it. But I'm implicated in it because it's in my museums, in museums that call themselves museums for me. And therefore I need to engage with it. I need to deal with it somehow. So I decided to make work about the Benin bronzes, and I went to Benin City. I made a film with the Oba of Benin. And I guess it's, yeah, so to go back to this question about who tells what history, I feel that maybe I'm a mediator. I'm trying to meet people and hear their stories, not necessarily me telling their stories. I don't want to speak on someone else's behalf. So here we have a Dengbesh, a Kurdish Dengbesh singing. He speaks on his own behalf. I'm not speaking for him. So there is always this kind of, yeah, there is a difference between speaking for someone or speaking with someone. And I try to speak with people, be in conversation with, and be somehow a medium or a mediator to make perhaps also people and places seen and heard that do not have visibility or audibility. And through my work, I can, yeah, through my work, I can do that. So really, dialogue is always part of it. It's not, yeah, it's most of the time it's not my knowledge, and it's not also obviously orthodox historical knowledge. I'm talking to people, I'm discovering things that are not in archives precisely. They are in places, in people. So I rely on a huge amount of hospitality and collaboration to do these projects, and they are part of how the work gets made and are inscribed in the work. I wanted to just briefly mention a project that I won't go into much detail, but this very question of being inside and outside was thematized in this project, where I was both. The project is called Unmade Film, and the starting point is a mental hospital in Jerusalem called Kfar Shaul, where a great aunt of mine who survived Auschwitz she ended up in Jerusalem and had a breakdown and ended up in this mental hospital and basically stayed there for the rest of her life, where I visited her as a child, so I knew the place very well. And it was a residential hospital with different buildings for different kind of units, and it specialized in Holocaust survivors. And I found out subsequently, much later, that it was actually a Palestinian village, Dir Yassin, which was famously massacred in April 1948, ahead of the Israeli Declaration of Independence to create ethnic facts on the ground in an attempt to chase Palestinians, Arabs away from lands that would become the Jewish state. So a very so a very violent place that was then filled or made space for Holocaust survivors. And when I found out, of course, I was just extremely shocked that you could treat people from who had experienced one trauma, who had been to concentration camps, and house them in buildings where a massacre was committed against the local population. I mean, it can't get more crazy than that. So it's quite a complicated project. Essentially, it's also a project about failure. And about the impossibility of catharsis, the impossibility of closure. And so the project is not a film, it's called Unmade Film, and it consists of different parts that make up a film, but not the film itself. So what we see here is the reconnaissance, which is actually a hillside just where the mental hospital is on the other side of this hill. And what we see are the ruins of one of over 400 depopulated Palestinian villages, and one of the only ones that still exists as a ruin. All the other ones had been repurposed or completely destroyed. It's called Lifta, and I thought I kind of used it as a stand-in, maybe this sort of like a film reconnaissance, maybe I can do my film there. And that sort of became a piece. It's quite complicated. Pasolini is part of it. There's a soundtrack, and other works are a sound work that is shown here in a Baroque museum in Italy, Castello di Rivoli, but it's actually just speakers and light that slowly dims. And it's a guided tour. An audio guide takes us basically through this place, in the present and the past at the same time. Again, this idea of spatial history. So he points out, this is the girls' school, this is the ward for schizophrenics, this is the bakery, this is the mosque. It's there, it's all there, basically. Because it is, the buildings are there, and the buildings are both. So it's, yeah, I'm not going to talk about the other aspects of the work. This is the script. I worked with psychologists, I worked with kids, I worked with musicians to make a soundtrack for the film. I did like workshops around theater of the oppressed, which became the staging, and the closing credits. And then the very last work is called The Proposal, which is like a film proposal. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly talk about this because, again, it's a very complex site of double violence, of a continuity, of an unacknowledged violence. There is no plaque there. There is no information. It's not acknowledged in any way. If you ask Palestinians about this place, everybody knows Deir Yassin because it's a very important moment in the Nakba, in the Palestinian catastrophe, but nobody knows where it is. It's disappeared from the map. It doesn't exist. Nobody can place it. Nobody knows where it is. So it's this kind of, yeah, it's truly a ghost. And it's, yeah, and as I said, as a ghost, it's yeah, it's a demand for justice. Yeah. And my position in all this is very complicated because obviously there are two histories linked here, and I was doing research in the West Bank and Jerusalem and in the hospital, and so yeah, very, very complex to negotiate, and emotionally, but also very important for me. We don't have that much more time. I have a lot more things that I was going to show, so I'm going to be maybe very fast, but we had a bit of the discussion already. So I'm maybe just going to mention a few things without going into too much details, because I actually was going to talk a lot about plants, which have become very important for me. And this is sort of like part two. This is an image of the National Botanical Garden in Cape Town in South Africa. I was invited to do research in South Africa, and actually nothing to do with plants. Much more, I did visit a lot of archives, and maybe going back to your question, Maria, yes, I work with archives. Archives play a role, but then I often leave archives behind, and I don't include traditional archives so much in my work. This was the same here. I did a lot of research in like Mayibuye archive of the ANC struggle, things like that. I didn't feel it was for me to work with this material. I didn't feel I had a position that I could inhabit in relation to it. But then I had a chance meeting in the cafe of the Botanical Garden in Cape Town, after which I walked into the garden and started noticing all the plant labels in English and Latin. And this just triggered a kind of realization of the continuing entanglements between Europe and its former colonies, which obviously kind of brings us back to the first colonial expeditions when the first Dutch arrived, which were often also scientific expeditions to chart the territory, including botanists who were discovering new plants, which were new to them, naming them often after themselves. In this case, a botanist called Rawlinson found this plant, and completely discarding local indigenous knowledge, and inscribing these plants in the European system of classification, using the Linnaean system of classification with the Latin species and so we species and genus. And so we're over 25 years after the end of apartheid, after the end of a kind of colonial oppressive regime. And still we have knowledge structures that produce forms of what Spivak would call epistemic violence, where knowledge is still suppressed, and the violence of this new knowledge is being constantly reproduced. So this became a kind of the starting point for a 3-year research where I traveled through South Africa, recording plant names in 12 indigenous languages. The piece became What Plants Were Called Before They Had a Name. And is a sound piece, essentially, where we hear plant names in a dozen languages as a kind of sound garden, because obviously also the kind of orality was what made them, what was easy to suppress them.
Umnulu, Hana, Umkhulu, Sifutaful, Ludvonga,
Mpasanghala, Isidwadwa.
Just very briefly, I wanted to talk about this tree in particular as another form of endurance, of plant endurance. This tree was planted in the 1660s by the Dutch East India Company, who arrived in the Cape, at the Cape, to find a place to replenish the ships coming back from the East Indies to Europe. And they were always running low on fresh provisions, and therefore had vitamin C deficiency, therefore had scurvy. When they came ashore, one of the first things that they did was create a garden, a vegetable, fruit and vegetable garden, a huge one, I mean, a field. And the land was obviously not empty and not free. There was a local population, the Kwekwe, who were living there and who also had grazing cattle. So the Dutch planted this wild almond tree as a kilometer-long hedge surrounding this garden, protecting it from the animals, essentially, that could come in and eat the salads. So the planting of this tree, in a sense, is one of the first acts of colonial violence. And the tree obviously is implicated in this and is also a witness to it. So I've started thinking much more about what is more than human witnessing, what do we understand by more than human witnessing? How can plant witnesses? They're obviously not verbal. And there is an aspect of maybe perhaps we ventriloquize their witnessing, but there are also a sort of like witnessing collective with us. I can't really go too much into detail around this. It's a whole series of works of other trees with violent histories. It's called The Memory of Trees. And another kind of plant, a very benign plant remnant or colonial endurance is the geranium. This is a postcard from Zurich, where I grew up. And Zurich, Switzerland, has a lot of red geraniums. They're almost kind of national flowers in Switzerland. Nobody knows that these red geraniums are not Swiss, and they're not even geraniums. It was also the Dutch East India Company who brought them over from the Cape to Europe for the horticultural centers that looked always for new exotic plants. It was first called the African geranium and was then naturalized, literally, and now it's not an African geranium anymore. It's not even a geranium. It took the botanists 150 years, and then they realized it's actually a pelargonium. So I made a work around this and the proliferation of the geranium around the world. It's called Geraniums I Never Read, and is essentially a growing postcard collection of geranium postcards from all over, red geranium postcards from all over the world. And the last work I wanted to mention was a work, well, I have more, but the last work I will mention now is a work that started with a historical work, a reference I found also in South Africa of a court case from 1940 against an Inyanga, traditional healer, by the white establishment, who accused him of not sticking to tradition and using European plants. And I ended up finding 300 pages of transcript of this trial in Pretoria in the National Archive. And it was a sort of ready-made script that we ended up filming in a very particular way, also trying to intervene in the archive. So actors were changing roles. I didn't want to assign roles. You were the white guy, you were the black guy. They were kind of switching between gender and ethnicity. And the building played a role. I'm not going to show a clip of it, but what this led to was another work, which is a sequel to this film, where basically I realized that today we are in a sort of neo-colonial frontier where the opposite is happening. So he was accused of stealing from the West. Today we have a lot of Western pharmaceutical companies that scout in the global South, in South Africa as well, looking for a traditional medicine to then analyze in the lab and patent active ingredients and new uses. So I decided that Afabuka Nkobo, the accused of 1940, will travel through time and arrive in the present. And in the present, he organizes a kind of people's tribunal around this. So maybe I'll just stop with a clip, a very short trailer of that.
inkantolo yakempela le izobila.
Akuyona inkantolo. Ngikutshele kangaka. Imbizo le.
Kusho ukuthini lokho?
Kusho ukuthi akuyona inkantolo enejaji. Imbizo yabantu, uhlelo esizenzele lona thina.
The core, who are the original users of robots, make no money from this industry. They live in extreme poverty. And even the gatherers, the people who actually go out into the wild and find these robots, make no money out of it.
We're setting up regional documentation centers through which we're hoping to gather all local available indigenous knowledge and to capture it in a central database. That way, anybody looking to do research or product development on a plant will have to go through us, the government, to get consent from the original knowledge holders and also to negotiate a benefit sharing agreement.
Thina ulwazi lwethu silithathe emadlozini. If we give our knowledge without consulting with the ancestors or our fellow healers, our ancestors will be angered. And that will jeopardize the sacredness of our knowledge.
A lot of what used to be common land is now privately owned. We do no longer have access to natural resources.
Okay, but this is exactly why we need laws to conserve biodiversity.
Yeah, man, kykie. Conservation has always been a way to control the indigenous population. Preservation becomes oppression.